Hello and welcome to my comment session on your Google Hangout 1. I just wanted to thank you for being able to set up and conduct the session and participate in it. And one only general comment that I had for you to pay attention to is I had some difficulty with the sound. At the beginning, it was Amy. I think that I had hard time to hear, or maybe it was the source of a distortion. I think Amy, you couldn't hear the discussion either, or you were trying to focus on that. And then it sort of came and went from Raphael and Daniel. I could hear very well, and I could hear the beginning, and then towards the end, you just went totally into a blare. So. You probably should try a little bit of an initial run, 5, 10, few minutes before you start recording to just see how you all impact one another on, I'm not technical enough to know whether it's the amount of things that work at once and so on. But try to minimize, if you can, those noises, because it's not necessarily bad for me, it's for you. You can't really contribute as much to the discussion if you can't follow on what other members are saying. So I'm just going to comment on the things that I was able to discern, and I know you had a good conversation, so I know you covered the topics really well, and everybody was engaged. So I'm just going to come on a few things. I think you started by actual return. You started with one of the last questions. How do we know that investing in intelligence brings us the value, on the dollar, so to speak? And I think that your discussion revolved, and Daniel was talking about the fact that it's very difficult to talk and discuss something that you are preventing, right? So how do you justify expansion of those intelligence processes? How do you judge whether it's successful or not? And I think the only way to do it, you were arguing, is to look at the failures. So you can determine that you are not successful if you have a failure. Now that approach, if you look at Loventhal, discussion about different intelligence failures that were national security and foreign intelligence collection failures during the Cold War, that argument might not be very helpful, even though CIA was on a chopping block and the agency almost ceased to exist, during the assessment of particularly the fall of the Soviet Union, and the fact that it was a strategic surprise. But you had all those events with Powell getting shut down, with Bay of the Pigs invasion, with the fiascos in Nicaragua, the covert action fiascos, and the inability to predict the revolution in Iran, the inability to predict the fall of Soviet Union by the intelligence community, and CIA was particularly, blamed for it. So I don't know if this is very actionable, that we can say just because those things failed, the CIA was ineffective since the Cold War. But that's one way of looking at it, right? And so I think Daniel and Raphael were talking about this. How do you quantify something where you don't really know what you prevented because it didn't happen? And that's a problem with intelligence. You're doing something that you are discussing issues with people that have not happened. You can't address them from the criminal investigation standpoint, right? You can't issue a warrant because this has not happened. So domestically, it's a big dilemma. So I think that Daniel also and Raphael talked about how public awareness, increases the lack of secrecy, maybe. You're talking about secrecy and the nature of domestic intelligence. And you talked about post 9/11, and people are more aware about those events happening. Of course, when they didn't happen in the United States, they were not very much aware of the fact that terrorism, was fine and well in other parts of the world. But until it happened to us, we did not have this huge public awareness about this issue. And you had a really good discussion about that. The trading of security and liberties. Anna talked about the privacy, and you had a discussion about is the federal government really interested in your conversation if you're not doing anything wrong? And I think that you can take that discussion to the point where you are asking if you're willing to abandon that expectation. This is a first step towards potential abuses, and we have to keep it in historical perspective. And I will give you an example of France. During the French Revolution, you probably all know in this group that when French Revolution happened, it was the greatest thing on earth, right? Liberty, equality, and fraternity sounds very much like American Declaration of Independence. So when the French decided to off with the king's head and get rid of a despot, and they wanted to govern jointly, they had those great ideas that were novel on the continent. They were wonderful, they were inspiring, and they created the Republic. And suddenly they were without a manual how to run it and what to do with it, and lack of political history and organization to support it. So they created the Department of Public Safety that was in charge of making sure that this revolution was not threatened, that there was not threat to the security of that sacred new entity, which was, the baby of the French Revolution. And soon, because of that increased security for the, safeguarding the Republic from its enemies, they created what was called the law of suspects. So anybody that was suspect that they were not supportive or they were subversive to the new republic, they were being called in front of the court. Those courts were one day long and ended up, with guillotine. And so very soon, from all the opponents of the republic, or people who had any criticism, or that made some joke in a pub, or were not really particularly contributing finances, they were suddenly enemies of the republic, and their heads were rolling down. And it was the big terror of the French Revolution. And this is how terrorism was created. Terreur in French means horror. And so these horrible mass executions of thousands and thousands of people during the French Revolution to save the French Revolution from itself started modern day state-sponsored terrorism. And I think we have to be very cognizant of all the aspects, historical aspects like that. And, France is by no means the only country that had those abuses. Russia or Soviet Union is another one that instituted this wonderful, Soviet Revolution to get rid of its Tsar, to get rid of its Tsar family, also because they were abusive and people were starving and people took control. And then there was a secret police, NKVD, that was instituted by Lenin and then, supported by Stalin, that did very similar things that the French did during French Revolution. So any opposition, any dissent, anybody that wasn't agreeing, was under the enemy of the state label. They were interrogated and they perished. So I think that, we are hopefully in the era where we have that control and accountability, and I think Nahil has talked about accountability. But I think that the vigilance is, the best oversight of all. And I think that's where the people get concerned. People don't get as much concerned about, whether some kind of corporation tracks what you eat for breakfast or what you buy at the local store so they can create your profile. I think we are okay as American citizens to forgo certain privacy elements, to private entities. But when it comes to government, I think we are very leery. And so here, this issue of domestic intelligence gets very hairy. And so, from the aspect of civil liberties and security, we drive that point of, how the abuse is possible by the federal government. And so, I didn't get the whole details on your discussion on that, but, you talked about NSA and spying and accountability. The trade-off of security and accountability with wiretaps. And, you discussed we are going towards securitization. I believe you talked about the efforts and how much we are able to abandon our liberties to have airport security. And then you have studies on TSA, which did not exist right during 9/11. TSA was created after 9/11. And so we get red teams that test TSA, and we learn that 80 to 90% of items go through all those all this technology we've invested in, all those agents we have invested in, and we are getting research that says that it's totally ineffective, that it doesn't deter anything, that it doesn't, prevent things from getting through. So then the question is, are we getting, enough return on that security, and have we sacrificed those civil liberties for nothing? And then, the people, of course, it's been 16 years since we had 9/11, and so people are saying, should we revisit it? But then you're also asking, is there another aspect to the airport security? Is it what goes through in the luggage, or is it just the feeling that people have that they can travel safely? And that's a totally different, question for, the feeling about, being assured or being comfortable with the fact that that your country is doing the right thing. So two ways of looking at it. But the return that you talked about, the return, I definitely think that we need more research, but research is very difficult in intelligence matters, right? Because a lot of it is need to know, a lot of it is classified, and access to this is not typically available to scholars and researchers unless you work for the federal agency like Department of Homeland Security, which is, again, a paradox, because if the agency is doing research on itself, obviously it's going to be biased. So, some other aspects that perhaps you didn't think about that I'm throwing out there. I think that Amy mentioned the issue of intelligence, domestic intelligence gathering and profiling, and how, how this something preemptive where we don't have specifics, where we don't have a warrant, when we don't have a criminal case, but we have some general guideline, how do we collect intelligence that it's not affecting particular populations? And I think it's a very difficult question, because if you look at past events and you look at religious terrorism that it's inspired by misinterpretation of Islam in itself, it has been perpetuated by people that adhere to that religion that tend to be from certain backgrounds, right, from certain countries that are Islamic countries. And so, we tend to categorize things into groups in order to be able to analyze them better. And we have to make those classifications somehow. And then we do have that issue of, if you generalize and make those stereotypical assessments, and then you are on the border of profiling. So, can you avoid that in domestic intelligence collection? But we have that issue in regular law enforcement and as well. So, but it does cut, to the domestic intelligence gathering issue. You talked about Amy, I think, talked about the national security investigations of foreign and domestic, and this is really the big thing to keep in the forefront. Is we generally, as citizens in the United States, do not care very much about how we conduct our intelligence on foreigners. We want to be safe. We want to make sure that we spy even on our friends because, they have secrets as well, and it helps us strategize, and it puts us at economical advantage or political advantage or whatever it might be. So I don't think we are particularly concerned with the way we have perfected the tradecraft of intelligence gathering overseas. However, when it comes back home, we do have Constitution, we do have laws, and the intelligence process is not very supple to those laws because, again, we are looking at the things that are yet to happen with some degree of hypothesizing and speculation. And so now we're looking at, and I think you agreed that local law enforcement is the most obvious choice for doing domestic intelligence gathering, right? Federal agencies, the 16-member IC intelligence community, they're somewhere there in DC, right? Or in different centers. But the events will happen in the community, in the local community. And this is where you know something when you hear something. And so we talk about intelligence-led policing, community policing, leveraging policing resources to be the eyes and ears on the ground. But intelligence gathering in a classical sense, the one that we engaged in during the Cold War, is the ability to have certain methods and to develop assets. Particularly, assets development is particularly relevant with human intelligence, right? And you're going to read about collection disciplines in subsequent sections. But if we develop assets, that's a big part of developing credible intelligence, right? So now if we're looking at local law enforcement, how are they equipped to develop assets in the local community? Law enforcement typically works with confidential informants, and confidential informants are a totally different animal. Those are usually individuals that plea because they want a lesser sentence, or they want to cooperate or collaborate with law enforcement for reasons that are usually not very savory, and usually it's for some advantage of mitigating whatever penalties or criminal process against them. And when you're talking about intelligence for preemptive in a community, you're talking about appealing to something else with people, to their hearts and minds, and so they come out and they share and all that, and that's a change in perspective and in the mindset. And yes, police officers do have a trust, but they also have to safeguard that trust that they have with local communities. And the problem is that they are often a feeding source to those fusion centers of information, but they are not on the receiving end of intelligence product. And so they don't know what they are collecting purpose, because they might not have clearance, and Treverton talks about clearances of local law enforcement being an issue, to truly have that community at a local level that is in sync with the feds. Then you run a risk of having some abuses on your community by the federal government, and then you lose that fabric of trust that you had. And there are some studies that came out after 9/11 that looked at federal regulations about certain immigrants were coming down, Patriot Act, and there were those communities like in Dearborn, Michigan, that just very, very heavily Arabic communities that had ties with local law enforcement and cities and emergency managers for years, and it took a long time to develop those relationships. And then those task forces of federal law enforcement wanted local police officers to go with them to those homes to interrogate people, to canvass the neighborhood. And it was very traumatic for that community. And those police officers didn't want to do that because they had very strong ties to that community. And they knew it was, very, very aggressive on that community. So there is a dilemma there as well, and in how prepared or how prepared the local law enforcement is for actual collection, how well they are briefed what they're contributing to, and that's a big problem sometimes, that they're not seeing the whole picture because they're not. They don't have proper security clearances or levels of security clearances. And so, and then, you've got other players in that as well. So yes, they are logical. If we were to establish some sort of structure, probably law enforcement is that first level of knowing, being ears and eyes for gathering different pieces of information that can help in the future. But then they are also constrained by their mission, by a certain culture, by a certain mindset, which is, criminal case building mindset. And also there's no funding for them doing that. So, that's another issue. And I think that's really important to remember as well. When you talked about whether there should be separate agencies such as MI5 that is going to be created uniquely for domestic intelligence, I think the consensus in your group was, and Amy led, I think, a charge on that there is already DHS that has some function. But already FBI has that role for, since the National Intelligence Reform Act of 2004, sort of that we avoided a big creation of a domestic intelligence agency, and we sort of expanded the counterintelligence function of the FBI to take on that role. So the consensus was, no, we have to bolster or reorganize or use the processes that we have, processes of information sharing. And then you talked about the fact that the Boston Marathon bombing was such a successful operation. And I think this is, I'm glad you brought it up, because I want to ask you one thing about Boston Marathon bombing. I think we all agree that the response post-bombing was unbelievable. From the medical sector, from the hospitals being ready to accept those victims, being aware and educated about the incident command system and how they fit into the overall response, knowing how to deal with criminal aspect of it. So, all the shrapnel wounds and evidence that was in the bodies and stuff, the doctors and hospitals were very, very well prepared for it. Local law enforcement, state law enforcement, federal law enforcement shared resources. The city was prepared to go into lockdown, unprecedented. The whole city going into lockdown, which is a tremendous financial, economical impact for private businesses and stuff. And, they did that so that the security and safety agencies can do their job in doing their investigation, really, at that point. So that was all great. And the citizens responding to the calls of the federal agency and providing information. And if you see something, and, ultimately it was a private citizen that called in for Jakar Tsarnaev being in the boat in their home and stuff like that. So, but we're talking about response. Response is post-incident. When we're talking about intelligence, we're talking about the value before the event happens, right? So did we do great in Boston? And I think that we cannot be naive to think we did, because Tamerlan Tsarnaev was in the system, and he was interviewed, and he was on the FBI radar, and he was also a noted person of interest for intelligence apparatus in Russia. And we had access to this information sharing. So there were things that we still, intelligence-wise, could not do. FBI still could not push it far enough because of a lack of evidence. And so we still have that, legal constraints. No matter how we look at it, we couldn't prevent it. So then it begs the question whether, sorry, I think it's my clock, whether we could prevent those type of events, or whether we should focus on being able to respond to them generally. And it makes me think about my recent visit to Colorado, where I was at the National Hazard Workshops. I'm sorry, I think it's my sprinklers outside. So I was at the Natural Hazards Workshop, and we were able to go and see the area of a big wild forest fire from 2013. And one of the homeowners invited us on his property. And he was telling us about his mitigation practices for his house. Now, it's natural hazards, it's not a terrorist threat, but we are within the area of homeland security. So this is I want to bring that example to illustrate something. And so they moved to Colorado, and they bought that property because it was very heavily wooded. It was really beautiful, and they wanted to be in deep woods, far away from a big city, two retired people. But they realized very quickly that those wildfires are getting more and more common, and they have a tremendous toll on those communities in the mountains. And so they decided to, as they put it, they cannot fight the fire. They decided that they will learn how to live with it. And they went very strongly into mitigation practices of how they're going to live with it. And that started with, getting experts to give them assessments, what they needed to do. And it was cutting out the trees that they bought that property for those trees, and cutting them out in stages, tons and tons of trees. There went into thousands of dollars of expense to do that, getting rid of juniper, which carries embers, saving the aspens that are wet, retain the most water, and their natural moisture barrier for the fires to spread. And so they told us all those things that they did. And when you look at that property, all the houses in the area were burned to the ground. And there was 100 feet tall wall of fire on the perimeter of their property that stopped because there was no food for the embers to carry, because they did the mitigation so well that they actually had to do, the biggest thing that they had to do is they had to leave in a hurry. And then when they came back, they had to do the cleanup, which was, very, very extensive from the smoke. But their property was safe. And so now they have a plan for expanding the perimeter of that control of the trees even further. And the reason I'm telling you this is because it begs the question of, to what point prevention works, and at what point you actually learn to live with a threat or with a hazard. And you prepare for it, and you prepare as best as you can, and you do some mitigation strategies, and then you just focus on building that resilience. And it's yet for us to see what our response is going to be to a suicide bomber in the United States, because we haven't had one, and because we will have one, because it would be naive to think that it's not going to happen, right? So can we prevent it through domestic intelligence, or what can we prevent, and at what point do we really have to have a balance of certain things we have to learn how to live with, and perhaps that goes into this bigger discussion on certain civil liberties maybe we have to abandon for good. Maybe we will never ever go back to flying, with shoes on and without taking our belts off. And then we have to be very vigilant of how much more we surrender. Anyway, so those are some thoughts that I had, based on your group discussion. Let me see if I caught everything I wanted to talk to. You talked about fusion centers. I think, that they are a good solution to information sharing and to getting that intelligence. Again, you're going to have an article on fusion centers, and you're going to discuss fusion centers, so I don't want to get ahead here. But some of the complaints about fusion centers have been that they are very, very exploitative as far as local community goes, local law enforcement. They suck out all the information. And then because it is a very long process of the information going through the intelligence cycle, when the intelligence product actually happens, it's really outdated and not very valuable to the local community. And an example of those are certain suspicious activity reports that come down the pipe from, through those bulletins and joint bulletins and suspicious activity reports. They're outdated by the time they reach the local level back, because the intelligence, by its definition from Lowenthal, is not intelligence until it goes through the whole cycle of being processed, separated, connected, analyzed, confirmed, triangulated, ascertained that it is trustworthy, and then disseminated, hopefully, to the people on the lowest level, community level, local law enforcement. And then there's this last step that Lowenthal talks about, which is feedback. You expect that the local law enforcement will have a role in telling the federal government how they did. And I think that step is totally missing. I have not seen yet a study how local law enforcement agencies grade the products that they receive from those fusion centers, how they are actionable for them or not actionable. And actually what I have seen is a lot of agencies giving up on fusion centers and saying, we're not going to allocate resources to them because we're not getting much out of it. And so that's, a big question too on effectiveness. And some people say, well, there is that intangible value of we don't know when we have prevented. And then there's others that are saying, but we are dedicating resources that we don't have. But, we have response time of our police officers to a call that we want to decrease by a couple minutes or something. That's our goal. We can't do that if we keep on dedicating those resources to those efforts. So, that's another argument that can be raised there. But keep on thinking about those issues. And obviously, we're going to talk more about civil liberties and security and trade-offs. And I'm looking forward to your subsequent discussions. Thanks.